Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. We've got a really special show this time around because just in the last weekend here, actually in this field right here, there was a rally for the North Calgary High School. And because it's the field that we film in, because we're going to keep filming here until the high school gets announced, we were able to cover the whole thing. So we have a great little segment on that. But we're also going to talk a lot about t-shirts. We're going to talk about a bunch of other things. So stick around. It's time for The Breakdown. This is a very special little segment of The Breakdown right here because we're actually filming at the rally for the Calgary North High School. It's being put on by the advocates for the North Calgary High School, and there are representatives from all levels of government here. As you can see, it's a huge turnout, and this shows the amount of support and desire for the high school that these communities actually have. So hopefully the provincial government actually listens when they're putting together their budget, and they make sure that the funds are present to put together this high school that these communities have waited so long for.
The turnout for the rally was great, estimated by some of the media at 140, and I would agree that's probably about what we had. That's the best turnout that we've had out of the 3 rallies we've held so far. So it definitely shows that momentum's building. If this school isn't approved right now, potentially we will have a shortage of high school spaces in 2023. The CBE has already said they're in a crisis as of that year with a lack of high school spaces. The direct impact on everyone up here is significant. The students that are currently in the Catholic program, Notre Dame is full, so this frees up spaces in Notre Dame. The people who are happy going to Diefenbaker, well, Diefenbaker is actually already overcrowded. So this is beneficial to pretty much everyone up in North Central Calgary. And so I very much encourage everyone to reach out to their MLA and express the importance that this school is approved in this fall's budget.
The rally for the North Calgary High School is just finished wrapping up, but as you can see from behind me, a couple hundred people came out to show their support for this desperately needed infrastructure project. Now, hopefully, this rally, as well as the efforts of people throughout the community to try to draw attention to how badly this school is needed, not just for the communities of Northern Hills, but for the entire school system in Calgary, starts to get a little bit of attention from the provincial government. Now, obviously, we're going to continue filming, as we have committed to, in this field until the high school gets built, and hopefully it won't be too long because winter's coming. At the beginning of the month, yet another Albertan managed to make national news when the CFO for an Alberta-based oil and gas company decided to go to Ottawa and tried to take a tour of the Senate. Now, the Senate's now closed for renovation, but when he was trying to take a tour of the Senate chamber, he was told by the security there that the I Love Canadian Oil and Gas Canada Action t-shirt that he was wearing was too political, and he wouldn't be allowed to wear it on the tour. He was asked to turn it inside out. He did go on the tour, but he then took a story to social media, and of course it blew up all over the place. Now, in fairness to him, the Senate Security Office did apologize to him and say that under those circumstances, he should have been allowed to take the tour with his shirt on. In true Albertan fashion, though, about a week and a half later, another Albertan went to Ottawa, this time trying to take a tour of Parliament. And he was wearing a Canada Action branded I Love Canadian Oil and Gas hoodie. Now, he was apparently told by security there that he wouldn't be able to go on the tour wearing it because, again, it was too political. Now, this also blew up all over social media, and there's no shortage of heavy hitters in the conservative world who decided to try to make a little bit of political hay and virtue signal just how much they support oil and gas. And one of the most interesting videos actually came from UCP House Leader Jason Nixon.
Let's be clear. Support for the Canadian energy industry is not a partisan message, and it is not offensive. It is a common sense position shared by millions of Canadians coast to coast.
Now, while it's great that Jason Nixon is doing his best to voice his support for the oil and gas industry, there's a couple of little details and there's some nuance to this whole situation that we need to talk about if we really want to understand what's actually going on and get to the point that that video is actually just a little bit misleading. So, first of all, there's some very strict rules in our parliamentary system of government in regards to a bunch of different things. When you can talk, where you can talk, what you can wear. There's dress codes that even MPs and MLAs have to follow when they're in their respective legislatures legislative bodies. One of the rules that exists for when anything is in session is that you can't wear any kind of political logo or any kind of logo that's affiliated with a political organization at all. That's one of the reasons why, if you take a look at tapes of the legislature when the Premier and the MPs and the MLAs and their various governing bodies are speaking, you will never see a Liberal Party logo, you will never see a UCP party logo, and you will never see an NDP logo. It's because those are places where no logos are allowed. Now, at its core, the message of supporting Canadian oil and gas is a message that the vast majority of Albertans can completely get behind. It's one of the core industries in our province, and it has been for decades. In fact, there are so many people who support that message that some people even went so far as to call it,
it is a moral imperative.
Now, it's worth noting that the term moral imperative really only just refers to when somebody's conscience is telling them the right thing to do. Different people's consciences are going to tell them different things. But if we're going to talk about moral imperatives, it might be worth, especially in the context of the House Leader of the UCP government, it might be worth exploring other things that may be moral imperatives, like providing health care, like fully funding education and making sure that kids have schools to go to so they don't have to hang out in classroom hallways instead of the actual classrooms. And heaven forbid, for the Minister of Parks and Environment, it might just be a moral imperative to take a little bit of a look at global warming. But back to the actual shirt and the message on it. So it's really important to note that while the idea of supporting I Love Canadian Oil and Gas or I Love Canadian Pipelines or the various different variations that are produced of that shirt aren't inherently political, the organization that makes those shirts definitely is. If you don't live in Alberta and live and breathe the I Love Canadian Oil and Gas logos every single day on billboards, on bumper stickers, you name it, that logo somewhere, you might not know where that logo comes from. That logo is actually the brand of an organization called Canada Action. Now, we're going to do a deep dive on Canada Action on our next episode of The Breakdown because I don't want to get too caught in the weeds on this particular issue, but it's important to realize that the nonprofit entity that is Canada Action is an extremely political organization, and we've got some examples of how. Whether we're talking about Canada Action calling for boycotts of companies that they don't believe support oil and gas, whether we're talking about them propping up their favorite political candidates on their social media pages, and you better believe that there's a pattern to that, or whether we're talking about them sponsoring signage for rallies or signage for convoys traveling across the province or across the country, or even if they're calling for the Premier of the province at the time to fire somebody who had been appointed to office because they didn't believe that they were pro-oil and gas enough, there's no way that we get around the fact that Canada Action absolutely is a political entity. And that's okay. They're allowed to be. We live in a country where we have freedom of expression, and they absolutely should be allowed to pursue those agendas. So it's perfectly legitimate for Canada Action to take these stances, to run these causes, to have their petitions, but you don't get to do all of those things and call for changes in government structure and at the same time claim that you're just a little old nonprofit that's totally non-political and doesn't have anything to do with that. Saying something like that is a little bit like the manufacturers of these toys trying to say that Special Man isn't at all derivative of what the original thing is. It's transparent, and if you take a long enough look at it, you can see right through it. Now, just to put a little bow on the end of this whole segment, there was a section of Jason Nixon's video that he released that we bumped on a little bit. And that's where he was talking about how he would make sure that if you wore your Canada Action I Love Canadian Oil and Gas t-shirt to the legislature, you would be able to take a tour. Here it is.
And you can be assured that if you come for a tour of the Alberta legislature, these messages of support are not only allowed, they are encouraged.
And as much as it shouldn't come as a surprise that somebody who's as enthusiastic about politics as Jason Nixon is would use this issue to try to create some division, not only in our province, but in our country, if you listen really carefully to the video, you notice that he says you can wear your shirt on a tour, but he doesn't say anything about when the legislature's actually in session, which we found interesting, and we wanted to clarify that because it seemed like a very deliberate choice of words. So what we did is we actually called the Office of the Sergeant of Arms at the legislature here in Alberta, and we asked if somebody wore a Canadian oil and gas t-shirt to a session of the legislature starts back up on October 8th, would they be allowed to stay in the gallery? Unsurprisingly, the answer was no. So to be clear, the Office of the Sergeant at Arms confirmed that no political slogans or branding are allowed in the gallery while the legislature is in session. So even in Alberta, in Jason Kenney's UCP Alberta, if you go to the legislature while it's in session and you try to sit in the gallery with your I Love Canadian Oil and Gas t-shirt, you won't be allowed in. So in the end, one might almost think that instead of trying to take advantage of the average Albertan's lack of knowledge of parliamentary procedure, which is obscure and most people wouldn't know it anyways, rather than try to stir up this divisive rhetoric and try to make political hay out of it, the UCP government could have sent Speaker of the House Nathan Cooper out to do one of his educational videos about obscure parliamentary stuff and tried to raise the bar instead of having Jason Nixon lower it again. Up until very recently, Alberta had two separate offices that were responsible for monitoring climate change, as well as coming up with strategies for how our province was going to deal with climate change. These offices not only did some really important regulatory work in making sure that major emitters were actually following the rules that they were supposed to, but they also provided a lot of evidence to the rest of the world that Alberta as a province is serious about doing our part to deal with climate change. That all changed on September 10th. The Ministry of Environment and Parks decided that those two separate offices were going to be dissolved and their function was going to be integrated into the new structure that they're building within that ministry. Now, it's worth noting when we're talking about breaking down those two offices, with the current structure that the UCP has, they actually spend more money on combating anti-oil sands rhetoric than they do on actually monitoring what the environmental impact of the oil sands are. So just to be clear, the two offices that were responsible for monitoring Alberta's impact and the impact of climate change on our province, and the office that was responsible for reacting to that, have both been dissolved, and this has all happened under the watch of the Ministry of Parks and Environment. Who runs that ministry? That's right, the moral imperative of Alberta oil guy. Cool. On September 10th, Alberta became a province to hold an impressive new distinction, not necessarily one to be proud of. We got called out by Amnesty International. That's right. We got called out by Amnesty International. That's how good of a job we're doing of things right now. Basically what it boils down to is Alex Neve, the Secretary General for Amnesty International, has been watching very closely the way that the war room has been running and the way that the UCP government has been talking about anti-Albertan activities and the way they've been talking about anti-oil sands activities. And they have some real concerns that is wandering very close to some pretty significant human rights violations. In particular, the notion that there's a narrative being built that if you don't fully support the oil sands, then maybe you aren't following a moral imperative of some kind, and you are somehow not Albertan, or you're somehow a traitor to Alberta. And boy, did Jason Kenney respond. In a multiple-page letter of his own, he pulled out all of his big boy words. I'll be honest, I had to look a couple of them up myself. And he basically said that when you compare Alberta's track record to other countries around the world that have horrifying track records in regards to human rights, we're actually not doing all that bad. Because when you've got your hand caught in the cookie jar, no, look what that guy's doing over there, is always the most credible defense to use. But things got even worse. When Jason Kenney was speaking at an Oil Sands Petroleum Conference, he had some really alarming things to say about what he's learned from all of those countries that he used as examples of what we shouldn't be doing.
Well, they know they couldn't get away with this in Vladimir Putin's Russia. In fact, you know, Greenpeace did do a protest on an offshore rig in Russia, and their crew was arrested and thrown in a Siberian jail for 6 months, and funnily enough, they've never been back. I'm not recommending that for Canada, but it's instructive. It's instructive.
Now, a lot of people are looking at Kenney's comments as sort of a clumsy, out-of-touch attempt at some form of humor. And they're trying to justify it that way. But the reality is that inflammatory language from political leaders emboldens action. Now, I couldn't help but think, we've seen somewhere recently a political leader say something similar about how they'd like to deal with protesters. What was that again?
And he's walking out, and we're not allowed, you know, the guards are very gentle with him. He's walking out like big high fives, smiling, laughing, like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you.
Now, it's worth noting that Trump's rallies became renowned for the level of violence that happened and was expected. And there were protesters that did get hit. And in fact, Trump offered to pay their legal bills. So when a political leader starts to use language like that, there are always a few people on the fringe who are going to listen and take it as permission to do something like what they're talking about. I guess it's not just Vladimir Putin that Jason Kenney finds instructive. There was some really significant news that came up in healthcare over the last couple of weeks under the UCP government. One of the things that they decided to do was provide funding for 30 new nurse practitioners to work in rural communities. And that's really, really important because in rural areas, there's a lot of people who have a difficult time accessing healthcare, which is probably one of the reasons that their decision to close blindness clinics in a bunch of rural areas across the province at the same time is a little confusing. For those of you that don't know, there's an organization that provides blindness services, blindness rehabilitation, and blindness counseling that makes a big difference for Albertans whose vision has been negatively affected, whether or not we're talking completely blind or all the way to just significant vision deficits. And they do a lot of really important work to making sure that those people can still be a part of society. And in rural areas, where the UCP has acknowledged they have a difficult time accessing healthcare, those clinics play a pivotal role for people who are suffering from vision difficulties. So for the UCP to pull out all of these clinics and close these clinics at the same time as they're doing all of these other things is, at the very least, short-sighted. Welcome to another one of our interview segments here on The Breakdown. Tonight we're very fortunate because we have, for the second episode in a row, yet another PhD doctorate. Full disclosure, I do have a bit of a history with this next guest. She was able to use her position as an elected official to provide some very significant needed help for my family and, quite honestly, families across Calgary in changing the way that emotional support animals are used. You can go ahead and Google that if you want the full background, but I do believe in full disclosure, so there we go. But it's an absolute thrill to have with us tonight Dr. Jyoti Gondek, Ward 3 Councillor, bringing a much higher level of intelligence to the show than we've had for the last 5 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us, Jyoti.
Thanks for having me on.
So to start with, you were elected Ward 3 Councillor in the last civic election.
Yes, in October of 2017.
What did you do before that?
A whole bunch of stuff.
Okay.
So I started off being an adult, working with the government of
Born as an
Manitoba. I worked with the government of Manitoba.
Poor mother.
As a policy analyst.
Okay.
And very quickly learned that I was not really good in bureaucratic situations.
And so you ran for office.
Well, so I ran for office, exactly. So I wasn't crazy about doing that kind of work, so I entered the private sector. I worked with a credit union in Alberta, and then I worked for Credit Union Central. I worked for Greyhound Canada, and eventually I opened up my own consulting business and did that for about 12 years, worked with a lot of different companies, and I ended up finding a sweet spot doing atypical research for land developers and builders in Calgary, where I made them think about social science research rather than just market research.
Okay.
And in doing all of that stuff, I also volunteered on a municipal campaign in 2007, became very interested in civic issues, and 10 years later, ran.
Perfect. Any regrets?
None at all. I'm
Excellent.
really happy that I'm doing this.
Okay.
Some days are tougher than others, but happy to be here.
It has been an extremely, let's use the word dynamic year for City Council. And so I have a couple of topics that I want to hit off first. To start with, why is City Council so broken, and how can I blame you for it?
Okay. Just blame me. You don't really need a reason.
No reason.
Yeah, no reason.
It seems to be what people do on social media.
It's Gondek's
so
fault.
I figured, yeah. Just blame me. But in all seriousness, we've had quite a bit of problems with the tax situation. So explain that to me like I don't have a PhD. How did that get to be, and where are we at right now?
You know what? If you remove any kind of academic credentials from all of this, it's not an easy thing to understand if you don't do it for a living.
Okay.
So that's number one. And the other thing that we began to see is that because we weren't being given absolute values when we were budgeting, there was an assumption made that the revenues that were being provided to set the budget were being set appropriately based on the number of properties there are in either class and what the assessed value is.
Okay.
That we were being given budget numbers that made sense. Fact is, we didn't ask for the absolute values. So when we did after the fact and we realized that the properties that only make up 20% of the assessed value were actually paying 55% of the operating budget, that's your problem.
Okay.
So we don't have a hole in the downtown. We don't have a big hole in the budget. What we have is a problem where we didn't budget according to the assessed value of the properties, which is the only revenue stream we have as a municipality.
Okay.
So that's not easy to get your head around if you haven't typically budgeted that way.
Where are we at right now with all of that?
So as a result of the schmozzle that happened in March and April in terms of setting a tax rate, one of the motions that I brought forward was to strike a tax shift assessment working group.
Okay.
And it's different than a committee because it doesn't need to have the formality of having city clerks run the meetings for us and be there, and it wasn't a true committee of council. So it was a bit more flexible, and it allowed for the private sector to come in and work with administration and council. So you could have three stakeholders at the table understanding each other's perspective and actually be informed from each other's point of view when we gave a recommendation to council.
Okay.
We've had 5 meetings of that working group. It's been incredibly productive. And on October 8th, I will be bringing the recommendations of that working group to Priorities and Finance Committee. And it is going to be structured as scenarios. So if we leave the proportion like it is, where 48% of the budget is paid for by residential properties and 52% is paid for by non-residential properties, what are the impacts?
Okay.
And then we break it down to if we did the tax increase based on the budget we set last year, it's 3%. If we only did an increase of 1.5%, or if we didn't do an increase at all, what are the implications?
Okay.
So we'll have some structured scenarios presented to council.
Okay. And council will be making a decision based on their individual perspectives, I assume?
Yeah, so the way we're structuring the scenarios, it really highlights the values
Okay.
that you want to bring forward. So if you value the public sector delivering services in a certain way, and you think that we're not overtaxing people right now, you may agree with the first scenario
Okay.
of increasing the budget by 3%. If you feel that it's important to get things in line from a business perspective and draw businesses here by making the ratio of who pays how much for taxes more equitable and more in line with other jurisdictions in Canada, then you will choose a different scenario.
Okay.
So the values that you hold as a member of council will be reflected in one of the scenarios, and then we vote.
Excellent. Odds of property taxes going up for residential folks?
You know what? The reality is that we have a situation where 500,000 properties were only paying for 45% of the budget, and 14,000 properties were paying the other 55%.
Okay.
And as I said before, those that were generating 20% of the revenue stream were paying 55% of the operating budget. It's been out of whack for a while.
Okay.
If we had addressed the fact that it was out of whack and we had tried to get it closer to 50-50 over the last 10 years, we would not be in this situation right now.
Why didn't we?
No idea.
Okay.
That's a great question for councils of the past.
Perfect. Well, we'll invite them on and see what happens then.
But to your point, it would make sense that there would be an increase to residential properties.
Okay.
But the other part of that is to drop the amount of the operating budget. So if you increase proportional share that somebody has to pay, but it's on a lesser budget amount, it may be a wash. That would be my goal.
Oh, okay. A couple of the other big issues that have certainly been dominating the news lately. It seems like there's a very adversarial tone to City Council these days. I've seen news headlines use the word dysfunctional.
Yep.
So I guess the question that comes from that is it as bad as everybody seems to think it is? And if so, why?
It's an interesting place to be. It's not like the other orders of government where you have the party system.
Yeah.
So you've got natural alliances, if you will. It's every individual weighing in on decisions based on your principles, the needs of your community, and frankly, your understanding of a particular situation. Sometimes 3 or 4 of us are aligned on something and we won't be the next time around. And that's okay. I think it's healthy at the civic level to be independent of party lines. A lot of the stuff we do has to cross party lines because we're dealing with other orders of government. I think it'd be a trickier and more dangerous game to play to have party politics at the civic level, because then you're inserting that into one more order of government.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is people have their own perspectives, they have their own wards to represent, and it becomes a little messy. But I have to say, I think one of the things that I struggle with on this council is the level of disrespect that sometimes comes in the commentary. I've been on the receiving end of comments like, Councillor Gondek, once again, you haven't done your homework, you haven't prepared.
So we're talking from other councillors, not
Oh,
even
yeah.
social media.
No, not social media. Social media is better than that. No, but it's sort of that really jabby kind of, you didn't do your work and you don't know what you're talking about. That's fine, say what you will, but it's not a fact. I'm always prepared when I go in, and if I'm not prepared, I openly admit it.
Yeah.
So we've got to stop sniping at each other. You can disagree with somebody, but you don't have to snipe about it.
Why do you think councillors are sniping at each other?
I'm not too sure. You know what? Times are tough, and we've got really hard decisions to make. And I think some people are able to make them maturely and professionally, and others just aren't.
Okay.
And that's kind of a jab in and of itself.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And the other problem I have is I've been very vocal about this, so I don't feel like I'm saying something people aren't going to expect me to say.
Yeah.
If the chair of the meeting needs to editorialize every single time somebody makes a comment, it sets a tone. And if you set that tone from the top, then the meeting devolves into what we get.
Okay.
So if you set the tone that somebody makes a comment, it should be respectful, debate it professionally, respectfully, and let's move on, things might be different.
Interesting. Who's your favorite city councillor to work with?
I have a bunch of favorites. I have worked with all kinds of different people, and this is one that I think everybody will be a real chuckle. We had a meeting last week where Councillor Farkas said something, and I looked at him, I said, can someone document this? This is the day Councillor Farkas became my BFF. And we had a good laugh about it. But we are very aligned on the tax shift situation.
Okay.
To a degree. And then we disagree on other things.
So it depends a lot on what the topic is, who you're going to
Depends on the topic.
BFFs with.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. The Green Line.
Yeah.
Let's get into that.
Oh, let's get into that.
So, is it ever going to happen?
Well, our interview today is timely. Because
Perfect.
we had...
planned it that way.
Did you plan it that way? That's well done. We had a Transportation and Transit Committee meeting today.
Okay.
And the Green Line update came forward for Q3. And one of the questions I had was, are you in fact looking at how Phase 2 will be executed of the Green Line plan? Because as we all know, Phase 1 is on the docket right now to use up all of the funds that we have. And it only goes from 16th down to Shepherd. So all of Ward 3 is completely skipped. Ward 4 is completely skipped. And Ward 2 doesn't benefit from anything either. So North Central Calgary pretty much got ripped off in this.
Okay.
And I've been vocal about this from the beginning. I don't think the prioritization of the South was just. I think because the Southeast Transitway enabling works had started, it was determined that it was easier. But if we actually based it on proper criteria, the ridership demanded that it come north first. But I'm supposed to let past decisions go. So my question today was, what are you doing to make sure Phase 2 will launch if there's money available? I got some good responses. They're assembling some funds to put together the land purchases along Center Street. They're working on it. But we're resource strapped. How much are you working on it?
Yeah.
And Councillor Davison brought up a good point too and said, if you're resource strapped and the priority is Phase 1, why are you working on Phase 2? And he said, at the risk of having a shoe thrown at me, why are you working on Phase 2? So I did come back and say, if you're not working on Phase 2 and money appears and it's not ready again, we will not get the North Line again. So this is a very tricky situation to be in. And then I believe I may have lost it a little bit and said, because if you're not actually serious about the North Line, maybe the North Councillors should start bringing forward notices of motion asking for a relook at regional rail. Maybe what we do is feeder lines over to a regional line that would actually service Airdrie and all of the population up here and take us toward downtown where we need to be. So maybe that's what we need to do.
So if, just to sort of draw some connections for the 3 people that watch our show.
Yes. Sometimes 4.
Sometimes 4. It depends on whether or not it's past my kid's bedtime. What you're trying to propose to do with preparing for the second phase is not that different from what Creating Coventry is trying to do in regards to having plans built out for all of the parks that it's trying to do. Would that be a fair comparison?
Pretty much. So what's been happening with the north leg of the Green Line is there's an alignment on the table, and it's along Center Street. That changed from the past, where it used to be aligned along Nose Creek, so along Deerfoot.
Yeah.
It's been moved over to Center Street because it would actually serve more people.
Okay.
But there's been no land assembly.
Okay.
So right now you could not put track down Center Street because there's businesses and people that live along there. So the land assembly was the biggest hindrance in getting the line to come north. Now, up here in Ward 3, we don't have a problem with that because we have that massive right-of-way set aside along Harvest Hills Boulevard.
But getting between the two.
Exactly.
Okay.
So my other question has been, why wouldn't you start at the north, at North Point, right over there, and go down towards the south? And by the time you did the enabling works along Harvest Hills Boulevard, maybe you could assemble the land along Center Street. So start up here and go down instead of always focusing on the core and radiating out. But that's been met to no avail. Everybody seems to be pretty stuck on how we propose to do this in May of 2017.
Okay. So it would be fair to say then, just because I want to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting things, it would be fair to say that right now, because of the lack of planning that's happened for however many decades we're talking about,
Yep.
If somebody showed up with, how much does the whole thing cost?
I don't know
Ballpark.
what the north leg is going to cost. I mean, right now,
Let's say 30 billion. We'll just pull a number out of
it's
nowhere.
$5 billion right now
Okay.
to build phase 1.
So if somebody showed up with 15 billion
Yeah.
and said, there you go, we still wouldn't be able to make any progress on it immediately because of the lack of planning that's happened to this point.
We couldn't do anything up in the north, going from downtown up to the north, the way everybody wants to radiate up.
Yeah.
We couldn't do anything until we assembled the land along Center Street.
Okay.
So if somebody showed up with a bag of money tomorrow, my biggest fear is that we'll go farther south.
Fair enough. Okay. The high school. I know that it's not necessarily civic, but there was a big rally that was held this last weekend.
Yeah.
Almost 200 people showed up for it. What are your thoughts on the future of
This piece
that
of land.
empty field right over there?
Yeah. You know, and I said this at the rally as well. Sometimes people will say to me, what do you care? It's not your jurisdiction. You're a municipal elected official. It's not your problem, none of your business. You can't do anything about it. You know what? People can do a lot about things when they rally together, as we did on Sunday, and take a stand. And I was really impressed to see that, you know, we had federal representatives there. Michelle Rempel was here. She's been our MP. She has been behind this project for as long as she's been around. We had 2 of our 3 MLAs show up and advocate for it. We had our CBE trustees show up. So now you've got multiple levels of government that are willing to work together and execute on this project. And I think it's important to remember from a municipal point of view, we kind of get left out of the equation. So as a counselor, I have no influence over what the school is going to look like. I barely have influence over the infrastructure that's needed for the school to be successful. Most of the time what happens is it gets plunked down and then we have to retrofit the infrastructure solutions. So the Coventry Elementary School is a really good example for anyone that's familiar with that project. It was going to be a disaster for the parking lot in and out.
Yep.
And as a city, we sat down with the CBE and with the province and said, these things will happen. We can tell you this because we're local. And we managed to change the plan to be considerably safer for everybody involved. So it can be done. You can move these mountains, but you have to be willing to fight that fight, and I'm willing to do it.
So with the expectations, I mean, there's a lot of optimism certainly coming out of the rally. There's also, I think, a provincial expectation the next interim budget and then potentially the budget after that we see in March or April or May are going to be largely budgets of austerity.
Yep.
Do you remain committed to raising awareness for it and trying to get your counterparts at various levels of government to make this thing a reality?
You know what? In times of austerity, if you're not united and strong about the things that you need, that's when you'll fail the easiest. It's easy to be lackadaisical when it's a prosperity time. In a time of austerity, we have to demonstrate that letting go of our kids' ability to be educated is the worst thing we could do. And to not look at the health impacts of busing our kids out of our communities, to not look at the dropout levels, to not look at their chances for a strong and solid future would be a mistake. And, you know, Panorama Hills is the biggest community in Calgary. For us not to have a high school up in this area, a public high school, that's just a mistake.
Well, they're all just high schools now. There's no public anymore.
Yes, that's right. Well, then we have one high school, but
Then
it's over capacity.
There we go. There was news today as well about a project that you're spearheading that also got a little bit of attention on social media. This business with the smartwatches. What's that project about?
So it's interesting. When something comes forward to committee or to council, it needs to be endorsed by a member of council.
Okay.
So I won't say I'm spearheading it. Andrew Sador from City Administration is a really smart guy who is spearheading this with Dr. Reid Ferber from the University of Calgary. So they're the two smart folks that came up with this.
Okay.
I just happen to be the advocate for it. So in a nutshell, what they want to do is see if we can use information collected from smartwatches, biometrics, if you will, that indicate how people feel when they're experiencing the city. And that sounds super cheesy, but I'm going to give you an example. What's it like to cross the intersection at Harvest Hills Boulevard over by the Superstore?
Not relaxing.
It's not relaxing. It's actually kind of stressful, right? Now imagine being somebody with a disability. Imagine being somebody who's elderly and that red hand comes shooting up and you're not even a quarter of the way across. You can't really stop in the middle. What are you going to do? So for me, what I'm hoping to do is generate the type of data that allows us to make sound planning decisions and not repeat the mistakes of the past.
Okay. The price tag that I think that I saw, I'm working from memory here, was $57,000?
Yeah, $57,500 is what the university and the city would want the city to contribute to the project.
Okay.
And that's to create a web portal where the data would be uploaded from the smartwatches. So it would be a portion of the entire project's cost.
Okay.
But to the city of Calgary, it's only $57,500.
What's the potential return on investment for something like that? Like in a time of austerity where we're hearing stories about police getting cutbacks and fire departments getting cutbacks and everybody and their dog getting cutbacks.
Yep.
Is there a tangible return on investment for a project like that that's costing $60,000 when they're shutting down different services across the city?
That's been a question that a lot of people have asked. There's been a lot of people on social media actually that are really upset with me wasting their taxpayer dollars. And I get it. I don't think I am.
Okay.
I think I'm actually being fairly frugal
Okay.
because one of the things that this project will allow us to do is build infrastructure better and smarter and cheaper.
Okay.
Okay, so if you actually
Excuse me.
understand how a user is going to experience an intersection and you can make it safer before you build it, that would be smart. And I'll give you the example of crosswalks that we have in our area that are not marked and they're not lit. They're dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
There's kids crossing to catch the school bus and they're almost nicked by cars every day. So if we had built it properly in the first place, we wouldn't need to retrofit it with rapid flash beacons or a light or do the marking of the pavement. So if we can get things right the first time, it's going to be safer for people. So ultimately, you're not going to have police coming out and monitoring it. You're not going to need to have EMS coming out and attending to people. So let's build safer and better communities by doing smart things up front and understanding how they need to be designed.
Okay. So if I understand correctly then, the argument is that this program will allow a collection of data that, while it costs $56,500, I think you said, up front, the potential costs on infrastructure down the road and in human life are going to be hugely offset by that.
Absolutely. Like if you talk to parents in Hidden Valley, for example, where the kids from Hanson Ranch have to cross the street and that street is Beddington Trail, we could have planned that a lot better.
Yeah, I would
Right?
say
Like,
so.
and I don't think anybody needed a smartwatch to do that.
Yeah.
But if you need data to demonstrate that this is not a wise or safe or smart decision, then let's bring it on. If we've got the data available, let's use it for good.
Sounds good. You have roughly 2 years left in your term.
Yeah.
Plans?
Keep advocating for the stuff that we're missing up here. I mean, when I think about all of the things that we were overlooked for, to me, I dug into something today. Some of my fellow councillors are really vocal about, we approved 14 new communities and it's sprawl that's costing taxpayers money. Kind of not a fact. It's a bit of a fallacy. So the sprawl that they're talking about is actually completing some of the communities that we started 30 years ago and never finished.
Okay.
So it's Livingston and Carrington not having retail, commercial, industrial, and employment centers. That would be a mistake.
Is Center Street ever going to be a straight line?
Let's not get into that.
That's the contentious one. That's the one that goes over the line.
That's the contentious one. But you know what? Some of these 14 new communities, as they're being called, two components of that are actually finishing off the lands beside Livingston and Carrington. One of those so-called 14 communities is actually Simons Valley Ranch.
Oh, wow.
So we didn't approve 14 brand new suburbs. We approved growth where we felt it was appropriate. And along with the growth comes levies. So the private sector pays for certain things. They pay for 100% of the infrastructure for water and wastewater. And when it comes to transportation, they pay for 75% of the cost. So for, I think it was a $26 million investment from the city for those projects, we're generating billions of dollars of infrastructure capital from the private sector. So we will be able to finish off things like the 14th and Stoney interchange, which has been the bane of everyone's existence. The other thing that I found quite interesting is that there's a provision within the off-site levy bylaw, which is the technical document of how those levies get spent. There's a provision to invest in bus rapid transit infrastructure. BRT, a proper BRT, not the fake 301 that's being called a BRT, which is actually just an express bus. So the MAX lines that we just got in the city,
Yeah.
you know, Max Purple, Max Teal, Max
Yeah.
Orange,
Well, colorblind, so it's largely lost on me, but
those lines were 15% funded by growth on the edge.
okay.
But there's no BRT line up here where the growth is actually happening. So I would like to open up those conversations and ask why the center of the north has been completely ignored. If you take a map of the rapid transit network in Calgary and you overlay a map of where future dollars are being invested on bus rapid transit, there's a massive gap in north central Calgary, and no one can explain to me why.
One of the arguments that I know that I've heard from people over the years, I've been in this community for over 10 years now. One of the arguments that I've heard is that our communities are typically quiet. I think there was one city councillor who even said something to the effect of, "There's not going to be a riot in north central Calgary." What can what can people who live in these communities? I mean, you've outlaid a lot of ways that demonstrate that those problems are ongoing, whether or not it's we're paying for somebody else's BRT, whether or not it's we don't have a plan for the Green Line, whether or not it's we're still waiting for our high school. What can people who live in our communities do to change that pattern?
A bunch of things. Firstly, educate yourself on which order of government is responsible for which service or infrastructure, and make sure you know who your elected representative is.
Okay.
And make sure you understand what their position is. And when election season comes, make sure you vote to keep them in or vote them out, depending on whether or not they align with your values. And when it comes to election season, for any politician, make sure they understand our neighborhoods, because it is mind-boggling to me how many candidates didn't even know we don't have a public high school. I couldn't believe the number of candidates who
Federally or provincially? Or both?
Federally, provincially, civic, you name it.
Wow.
People that don't understand who's responsible for jurisdiction of certain things. Like, make sure your candidates get it and make sure they stand up for you. I cannot stress that enough. It would be easy for me to sit at council and say absolutely nothing.
Okay.
I could sit there and cruise through and never advocate for a thing. But that's the whole reason I ran, was to stand up for our ward and stand up for the things that we need. So know who you're voting for, because they'll ultimately be critical in getting you stuff or not getting it.
Okay. Is there any value for you as a councillor if people correspond with you and let you know what their concerns are? Is that stuff that you can take forward to help strengthen the arguments for things that North Central needs?
It's always really good to hear from residents.
Do you prefer emails or angry tweets?
You know what? There's a lot of people who are quite frustrated with me not responding to their needs on Facebook. Facebook is the one where I take a lot of flack. And
We
there's
have a
a
fairly
reason.
active Facebook.
We do, and there's a reason that I don't, because you can't explain everything on Facebook.
Yeah.
It's impossible to do. And different people weigh in with their opinions that sometimes aren't facts, and then nobody knows what the real conversation ever was. And so what I've always said is, if you officially communicate with my ward office, then I can officially do something. So I would always recommend that if you've got a situation where you can phone 311 and say, look, I've got a pothole, or this is a problem, or how come this is happening, and you get the service request number, that's gold. If you
Send it to
have
you.
that information, get a hold of my office and say, listen, I reported this, I've inquired about this, nothing's been done, then we can do something. I can't go in and open something up if I don't have a resident actually having filed a 311 complaint.
Okay,
So that's part of the issue. The other thing is, I'm always happy to hear from people. I would love to hear what their perspectives are, what the needs in the community are. Happy to hear that. You can call me, you can email me, you can social media me, that's fine. I will take it all into consideration. But ultimately, thing is, I've got to make a decision based on information I may have that everybody doesn't.
Okay.
So what I tend to do is post why I feel a certain way. And they're not short posts. They're generally fairly lengthy. I'm not a headline grabber.
Yeah.
I don't want to be that person. What I want to do is carefully lay out for people why I'm making the decision I am. And some people like it, some people don't. I try to give the nitty-gritty in the first paragraph, and then I'll give you more of an explanation. But I find that if you treat people with respect and you think that they're intelligent and you give them the information they need to make an informed decision, that's the right way to do things.
Excellent. Anything else that you'd like our audience, the 4 people, I'll keep my kids up late to watch this one, anything else that you'd like them to know about anything that's going on with the city or the community or anything?
The city is in a tough time. We're in an economic decline. We've got some challenges with the energy sector, but I would say that Calgary and Canada are generally pretty positive places, and we need to return to that. We will get through this. We will diversify. We'll be amazing again. We're just in a bit of a time where we need to rethink how we carry on. And during a time like that, the best thing we can do is come up with ideas to work together and collaborate and figure out how we're going to move further along. So it's fully my intention to collaborate with, my colleagues at the CBE and the Catholic Board, as well as the province and the federal government. I think it's going to take all of us pulling in the same direction to not only represent this area well, but to get our city and our province and our country out of the funk that we're in.
I don't think I can end on a better line than that. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
That's how we'll do it. So that's pretty much it for this episode of The Breakdown. We're hoping to get one more episode in before the legislature kicks off again on October 8th. Because Lord knows, they've said that they're bringing everybody back to the legislature early because they have a heavy legislative agenda. They've got a lot that they're going to want to do, which means we're probably going to have a lot that we're going to want to talk about. But before we go, there's just one thing that I wanted to touch on real quick. Some of you who follow the news may have heard the story about the gentleman from Calgary who, he's a Calgarian, he's an Albertan, he's a Canadian, and he gets his transit tickets printed in French. And one of the problems that he was experiencing was when his tickets were printing in French, there were some Calgary Transit operators who didn't believe those were real tickets. Now, French is an official language in our country, and if somebody chooses to have something printed in French, that's perfectly acceptable. If you look at a bottle of Coke or a box of Kraft dinner, you're going to see French labeling on that box as well. He tried to bring it to the attention of Calgary Transit via Twitter, where he just wanted to say, hey, maybe there's some training that needed to be done. And unfortunately, there's a few Albertans who decided to show their absolute worst side. And this gentleman's been getting death threats. He's been getting people saying all kinds of horrible things across him on social media. And they're not just saying horrible things about him, they're saying horrible things about anybody who speaks French in our province. Now, it's important to realize that despite what you might think, there's a significant number of people in Alberta who speak French. There are entire communities in Alberta that speak primarily French. There's nothing wrong with speaking French in our province, and there's nothing wrong with speaking French in Canada. So to the gentleman that was only trying to raise awareness, as much as all of these people have things that they want to say to you, I have one thing I want to say as well. And that's just merci. Go. Let's, in regards to monitoring the amount of emissions, managed to make national news when an a genie in a bottle.
Yeah, well, dad jokes.
And he was told when he was trying to take the tour when he was trying to take the tour. Yeah, it's like he was in time and space. It's ambiguous. Give me a sec. Trump offered to pay their legal fills. Their legal fills. Damn it. Now it's worth noting that at Trump rallies, Merkel. That's true. You could just stream of conscious it. Have you ever read a transcript of one of his things? Dude. You don't even need to do drugs. Those two separate offices in their own ministry. Now, it's really important to realize something. I don't know what it is, but it's important to realize it. Give me a second, and I will. Additionally, the current UCP government spends more money. So he was at when? The Ministry of Environment and it's not agriculture. Environment and Parks. Damn it. If you watch Doctor Who, you'd totally get it. Imperative guy. That was terrible. Let's do it again. Almost said a word, but didn't, because you're recording. Body didn't say it though. Official language. Oh, I was so close and I stumbled. It's bigger on the inside. We won't include that one. Let's try that again. It's like, I don't know what's happening anymore.